The theme of this video is whether Trump can repay the $6 trillion in US Treasury bonds that are due in June. The answer is yes, and the current sense of urgency is deliberately created by Trump. With the US's repayment ability weakening, it needs to resort to some tactics if it wants to borrow money at lower interest rates. A friend from Taiwan left a comment under last night's video, stating that even if China dumped all its US Treasury bonds at once, there would still be buyers. This is because US Treasury bonds have a credit rating of AA+ or higher. In the worst-case scenario, the Federal Reserve would definitely step in to buy them, as stabilizing interest rates is part of its mandate. Moreover, the majority of US Treasury bonds are held within the US itself. The Federal Reserve holds the largest amount, followed by trust funds, insurance companies, etc. Other countries around the world only account for 23% to 25% of the total US Treasury bond holdings. Therefore, it's impossible for the Chinese mainland to sell off all its US Treasury bonds. This friend from Taiwan thought I was exaggerating. I believe he might have misunderstood me. I made it clear yesterday that if China suddenly cleared all its US Treasury bond holdings overnight, it could potentially trigger a chain reaction, causing other countries in the European Union and even individual investors to follow suit. If that happened, US Treasury bonds could become unsellable, and the US dollar's hegemony could face a risk of complete collapse. However, this is just a possibility, not an inevitable outcome, and I'm sure China won't do that for now, because crashing the US economy wouldn't benefit China. After all, we still need to do business with the US. If the US has no money, who will buy Chinese products? Currently, it's essentially a game of chicken between Trump and the Wall Street bigwigs. Neither side wants the US economy to collapse, but both aim to make the other side back down while resolving the US debt crisis in order to secure greater benefits for themselves. Of course, China is also involved in this game, hoping to gain more from the US debt crisis. Some friends are worried about whether the US can repay the $6 trillion in US Treasury bonds due in June. I've addressed this question in previous shows. There's no issue with repaying this amount. Currently, Trump just wants other countries to buy more US Treasury bonds at lower interest rates. In other words, he wants other countries to share the burden of US debt. There's nothing inherently wrong with this approach. -1 US administrations have done the same. The key problem is that he can't keep spreading rumors about some so-called Mar-a-Lago agreement, proposing 100-year non-tradable bonds with zero interest rates. In reality, while the US debt problem is serious, it's not as dire as Trump makes it out to be, nor is it something that he should exacerbate to the point where it seems on the verge of collapse at any moment. Although I've been talking about US Treasury bonds these past few days, I've never believed that the US will collapse in the short term. The US Treasury bonds due in June are a factor contributing to the further deterioration of US finances, but the US definitely won't collapse immediately. The issuance of US Treasury bonds and the US dollar are interconnected. The reason US Treasury bonds have strong credit is that their issuance isn't arbitrary, and neither is the printing of US dollars. The US dollar is anchored to US Treasury bonds. However, under extreme circumstances, Trump can issue the US dollar without relying on US Treasury bonds as an anchor. That is, the Trump administration could, at the cost of the US's financial credibility and disregarding the normal procedures for issuing bonds and the US dollar over the past 200 years, simply print money. This could lead to inflation and a rapid devaluation of the US dollar, but it could also wipe out a large portion of the debt instantly. For example, if the value of the US dollar halves, a $36 trillion debt would effectively become an $18 trillion debt. The higher the inflation, the smaller the debt burden. In fact, if the US simply allows the US dollar to depreciate by 15% and injects a few $1 trillion into accounts, as Musk once suggested, the $36 trillion debt problem could be quickly alleviated. And this is without even using any complex financial instruments. Moreover, if the Trump administration manages its policies well in the future, it can gradually replace high-interest bonds with lower-interest ones. For instance, if interest rates are cut to 1% in the future, Treasury bonds with a 1.5% to 2% interest rate would still attract buyers. Then, Debts with a 4% to 5% interest rate could be gradually converted into lower interest debts. This is somewhat similar to China's practice of converting local government debts into national debts. For the US government, the pressure of a $36 trillion debt at a 4.5% interest rate is vastly different from that at 1% or 0.1%. If the interest rate is pushed down to 0.1%, the annual interest on a $36 trillion debt would be only around $36 billion, which is negligible. However, the key lies in how to compress interest rates, how to convert long-term debts into short-term ones, how to issue low-interest bonds in a global environment of generally low interest rates, and how to create an economic environment conducive to low interest rates. These issues are closely related to the Federal Reserve's interest rate adjustments and inflation management, making it a highly complex problem. The US doesn't need to issue 100-year non-redeemable bonds at all. It can simply push bond interest rates to the minimum. Trump's Mar-a-Lago agreement clearly shows that it wasn't devised by someone who truly understands finance. Yet he keeps using it to scare the world, and it's hard to tell what he's really thinking. Trump's current dilemma is that he can't implement quantitative easing QE. If he resorts to QE before other countries' economies collapse, he will lose the financial war. If the newly printed dollars flood the domestic US market, it will only harm the US economy. Without QE, the US Treasury bonds can only be absorbed by existing funds. But where are these existing funds? Trump initially intended to use tariff wars to extort other countries into buying US Treasury bonds, which is a common tactic. Unfortunately, this time he got the sequence wrong. He imposed tariffs first and then tried to negotiate the US debt issue. As a result, China stood up to him, and other countries got a 90-day respite. They are now hiding behind China, stalling for time to see if they can avoid buying US Treasury bonds. This is precisely why the $6 trillion debt issue seems so pressing this time. With $6 trillion in US Treasury bonds maturing, if Trump fails to secure support from China and the European Union, the funds to absorb these bonds will have to come from within the United States. But here's the catch. If capital flows into US Treasuries, what will happen to the US stock market? I'm not one of those who reflexively oppose Trump at every turn. I've said multiple times before that if Trump decided to strike Iran, resume support for Ukraine, or waged a trade war in a different manner, I'd back him. Sometimes, you need to teach those who break the rules a lesson. However, Trump has a knack for squandering good opportunities, which is why I find him so frustrating. But my dislike doesn't mean I oppose everything he does. I'm not that extreme. In fact, in the 3 months since he took office, he hasn't exactly made any commendable decisions. Let's get back to the $6 trillion debt maturity. Despite all his theatrics, Trump won't dare default. As I mentioned yesterday, he's acutely aware that letting this debt bomb explode on his watch would brand him as a historical culprit. So, he won't deliberately tank the US economy unless he's incredibly short-sighted. His current flurry of actions aims to extract as many benefits as possible while the US is still powerful, essentially trying to buy more time for the country. Think about Germany after World War I. The infamous scenario where 100,000 Reichsmarks could barely buy a loaf of bread stemmed from massive war reparations paid in marks. The German government, intent on defaulting, devalued the currency, effectively diluting its foreign debt. While this led to a sharp decline in living standards and economic chaos, eventually paving the way for the rise of the Nazis, it did relieve a significant debt burden and laid the groundwork for Germany's later economic revival. Does Trump want to pull a similar stunt? You bet he does. He'd love nothing more than to sign a Plaza Accord-like deal with China or the EU. But China isn't biting. Instead, China is watching closely, waiting to see how Trump extricates himself from this mess. The worsening fiscal situation due to the debt dilemma will trigger crises across military, political, social, and diplomatic spheres, a clear sign of America's decline. Yet, this tug-of war is just a temporary phase. Sooner or later, both sides will have to return to the negotiation table to resolve the ongoing tariff disputes. The only question is, when? It's naive to assume that the US and China will immediately decouple or plunge into war. Frankly, Whether it's $6 trillion or even $10 trillion in maturing US Treasuries, Trump can manage the repayment. As long as Congress keeps raising the debt ceiling, the US can issue new bonds to pay off old ones. And with the Federal Reserve acting as the beer of last resort, it can print dollars to purchase treasuries. In theory, there's no risk of these bonds going unsold. After all, with a fiat currency system and sovereign debt, default seems almost unthinkable. What's puzzling is Trump's insistence on exaggerating the severity of the debt issue. If this isn't an intentional undermining of America's century-old financial foundation, it's hard to fathom his motives. My take: his ultimate goal might be to oust Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Trump has long pushed to change the law, seeking the power to remove the Fed chair, a move that could potentially upend the very core of the US's separation of powers system. Right now, various domestic factions are locked in a standoff, each waiting for the other to blink, which explains why US Treasuries have become the talk of the town. On the surface, Trump seems to hold the upper hand for now. But as the power dynamics play out, we'll just have to wait and see how this drama unfolds. So, my advice: don't overanalyze my words and jump to conclusions about America's imminent collapse. Even if Trump weakens one pillar of the US economic system, another leader might continue chipping away at it. But make no mistake, the US won't crumble overnight. The US debt issue isn't about default. It's about a temporary liquidity crunch, a fact I've pointed out. It's frustrating when some viewers misinterpret my words, cherry-picking statements to draw false conclusions. A single sentence can't define the entire argument of an entire video, can it?